Okay, in this video we're going to talk about blocking, and as we saw in the PowerPoint slideshow, blocking is a technique in which we simplify the forms of the objects that we're drawing in order to establish certain basic things such as the correct shape of the objects, the proportion of one object to the other, and also the placement of those objects in space, and we'll talk more about that later on. But for now we're going to start with this simple setup. It's a bottle, and we'll proceed with the blocking technique. Three main approaches in terms of blocking: simplifying the shapes, seeing through the objects, so to speak, and subdividing the objects, and I'll work through that and talk about those as we move on. In terms of beginning a drawing, you always want to make sure that your object and your subject is going to fit the page. So one of the things that I do is to take the largest object in a still life setup, and just mark where the top and the bottom are going to be. And place it just so, we'll talk more about composition, but place it so that all the other objects will fit. That's one approach to composition. You can always zoom in and crop, but we want to make sure things fit for starters. So I'll start with a light line at the top, another line at the bottom, and work my way down. These lines, when we're blocking, they should be drawn lightly because they're meant to serve as a framework that we eventually will erase. We'll keep the lines that we want, but before we commit to making darker lines and shading, we work with a very light touch in order to be able to erase easily and make adjustments. So beginning with the top and the bottom, I'll actually start by putting a vertical line, a plumb line, which will be how I subdivide the bottle down the middle. When we're working with symmetrical shapes, it makes it a lot easier to establish those shapes, especially when they become more complex, if you're working with vases or things like that are symmetrical but have much more embellishment and detail. So starting with a plumb line, we subdivide, and in order to simplify the objects that we're drawing, really what we want to do is just kind of forget about what it is that we're looking at. It's a bottle, we know that. But if we simplify the bottle into its basic geometric shapes, it's a cylinder, or one cylinder, a narrow cylinder, the neck, on top of a wider cylinder, which is the body of the bottle. Once we place those down on paper, they'll basically be, at the very beginning, just a couple of rectangular forms, beginning with two straight lines that are evenly spaced left and right from the subdivision, the plumb line, and establishing where the neck of the bottle ends and the body begins. And in this way we begin to work with the proportions, the height and the width, and to make sure that it looks right. Before we commit to refining the shape, and definitely before we commit to shading and making any dark lines. Okay, so a couple of rectangles, and then I can begin by a kind of a circular shape up here. If you can't see the lines, they're being drawn lightly on purpose. I'll draw them a little bit darker, but you can see the motion, the movement. What I'm trying to do is establish the curve of that, what I call the shoulders of the bottom. Establish that curve. Once you have that, then you can begin to fill in and make the connections. But the way I begin to do that is by drawing a light, almost elliptical, not necessarily a perfect circle, but somewhat elliptical, to try and establish those curves right there. Concave, convex curves. And then work my way up with slightly darker lines if I feel like things are looking satisfactory. Then at this point I'll just continue working my way down, and these lines are a little darker, so you should be able to see them. And when I get to the bottom of the bottle, this is something that tends to give students problems. Conceptually, we know that the bottom of the bottle is flat, it's sitting on a flat surface, but we don't want to draw a straight line at that point. This has to do with perspective, simple perspective. The top of the bottle is more or less at my eye level. Anything that's at your eye level, that's going to be a straight line. But once we get to the bottom, we need to look carefully, because the bottle is a cylinder. It has a round profile, a round shape, and you can see that that's reflected. And the farther down that information is from your eye level, the more pronounced it's going to be. So the way that I establish those curves, even though it's the front curve that I really want, is by seeing through, essentially drawing an ellipse that makes the bottle seem transparent, so that you see the front curve and the back curve. Once I'm satisfied with that, then I can begin to darken that front curve. Anything that conforms to the curve of the bottle should be considered in that way, and it should more or less look parallel until we get to eye level, and then it's going to look more flat. If there were a label on this bottle, I would approach it the same way. An ellipse for the top of the label, an ellipse for the bottom of the label. And when I feel that they're looking good, then I can begin to draw darker lines. And they need to conform and suggest that they're wrapping around, that they're conforming to that cylindrical shape, okay? Up here, as I mentioned, it's almost at eye level. I do see a little bit of the top, so it's going to be a very shallow elliptical shape. And then you can begin drawing the details and filling in. It's the same concept. And essentially, that's blocking in a nutshell, a very simple shape. We subdivided with a plumb line down the middle. We simplified the shape of the bottle into basic cylindrical forms, but on paper we start with rectangles. Then we make the connections, and then we see through in order to establish the correct curvature of the different details and things like that, and especially at the bottom where the bottle meets the flat surface. The next video that deals with blocking will cover a more complex still life setup where objects are superimposed and then they suggest pictorial space, and blocking is extremely important in terms of working with more elaborate setups. That's it.